The New York Times has published the 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones. It says that the Revolutionary War was fought to preserve slavery, and that it was slavery that made the United States wealthy. The original sin in the United States is slavery and racism. Our culture is built on racism, and it is an unchangeable part of our society. Now, 1619 Project is based on critical race theory, which is cultural Marxism. It holds that only white racism matters, which is systemic in the United States. All blacks are victims, and all whites are still masters and oppressors. All whites are privileged. Now, to compensate for this, there must be social atonement and monetary atonement. Blacks are unable to do any better in America and must be helped. The 1619 Project is purely racist. Some critics have focused on errors within the document of the 1619 Project, but the biggest error is what is not said. 1619 does not mention, for instance, that Native Americans had extensive slavery before the whites arrived. Slavery has existed throughout the world since all recorded history. Instead, the history of slavery in the United States starts with the first arrival of slaves in the 1619. Where and how did these slaves come about? The reason is there were slave merchants on the west coast of Africa, Muslim slave merchants. Muslims ran the slave business because of a concept called sunnah. The sunnah means that Muhammad is the perfect pattern of a sacred life, and Muhammad owned black slaves, white slaves, Arab slaves, sex slaves, Jewish slaves, Christian slaves. He gave and received slaves as gifts. It was jihad that created the booty of war, and part of that booty of war was slaves. The first wholesale use of slaves by Muhammad was after he crushed the third and last Jewish tribe. He killed the adult males, adopted the children into Muslim families, and sold the women in wholesale lots. He used the money to buy horses, armor, and weapons for more jihad. Muslims have been in the slave business for 1,000 years before 1619. Islam has a complete doctrine of slavery and is still practiced today. It was an Islamic slave trade that furnished all the African slaves brought to the Western Hemisphere. Nicole Hannah-Jones probably does not know much about Islamic slavery and doctrine. Few people, including American blacks, know this. I taught for some years at TSU, which was a historically black university, and the only theory of slavery at this black university was the evil white men on wooden ships on the west coast of Africa. Some years ago, a freed African slave spoke at Vanderbilt, and I went to see Francis Bach. Now, you would think there had been a great deal of interest in this, but very few people came, including almost no American blacks. They simply had no interest. His story was simple. He and his sister went to the market to sell beans, and the jihadis attacked, killed the strong males, and took him and his sister towards the east coast of Africa. She was raped every night. And when he got to his new owners, they stripped him naked, and each of them took a stick and beat him and said, "You have no name, you are now called Abed, black slave." Now, is there a book that teaches the universal and ancient history of slavery? There needs to be. There also needs to be another book. Nicole Hannah-Jones needs to write a new book called The 627 Project, based on when Muhammad first started taking slaves, which was the beginning of the Islamic slave trade which came to America. If we're going to talk about slavery, why don't we tell the whole story instead of just the part of the story that we like best? Thank you.